here that I feel we need in these two miracle stories. The meaning of Jesus' miracles for today. So I'd like to begin with the story of how Jesus comes to the disciples in the middle of the sea, walking upon the water. That's Mark chapter 6, beginning in verse 45. Immediately, he made his disciples get into the boat and go ahead to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. Now, the story begins with, and this is our first clue, I think, to the meaning. It begins with the separation of Jesus from the disciples. He sends them away on to the other side. He sends them across the sea into what was Gentile territory. And he dismisses the crowds. And then he says farewell to them, and he goes up to the mountain to pray. Now, the first storytellers, Jewish followers of Jesus, of course, would have associated Jesus going up on the mountain with Moses, going up to the mountain to receive the Torah, the revelation of God's commandments, the 10 commandments. And Jesus is going up there to pray. So you get the setting. The disciples and Jesus are separated. The Gospel of John, which also tells this story, in chapter 6, verse 19, says that the disciples were 3 or 4 miles out on the water. So they're not near the shore when this happens. There's quite a separation here, and that is the tension in the story. Then when evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. More indications that the distance between Jesus and the disciples is part of the message and meaning of this story. When he saw that they were straining at the oars against an adverse wind. Now, this is so interesting. In the Greek, the verb that translates straining at the oars is basanitsein. Can you say that with me? Basanitsein. And it is a verb that throughout early Christian literature elsewhere is associated with persecution, with the experience of opposition. Now, that's what's suggested here. The disciples are encountering adverse circumstances that puts a strain on them. And then it says, he came toward them early in the morning. The Greek says literally in the 4th watch of the night. Now, ancient Mediterranean peoples, Roman and Jewish, divided the night into 4 watches. The last one was between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. In other words, the 4th watch is the deepest darkness, but it also culminates in what? Dawn. Right. And of course, again, assuming that the original storytellers are Jewish followers of Jesus, in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, the dawn is repeatedly associated with God's presence. Weeping may last for a night, but what? Joy comes in the morning, at the dawn. And then it says, he came walking on the sea. Now, the Greek is literally epites thalases, upon the sea. 19th century interpreters, Ray, attempted to rationalize the story, and they said, well, maybe the phrase epitestalases could be translated beside the sea. So Jesus is just walking in the surf, right? Like my younger son out there in Los Angeles. And the disciples concluded that he was walking on the water, but that's a mistranslation. The Greek is clear. Epi means upon with the genitive. And as we already noted, in John's version of this story, the disciples are how far out? 3 or 4 miles out into the water.
It would take 10 hours to row across that lake.
It would have taken quite a while. Yeah, they would have been either blown by the wind or rowing out onto they're trying to cross the lake. Jesus sent them over to the other side. And then it says he intended to pass them by. Now, this phrase has always puzzled interpreters from the beginning all the way down to the present, and often psychological explanations are sought. You know, maybe Jesus is not happy with the disciples, or he wants to go ahead of them and show them the way. But the clue to the message here, the meaning for us, is the little phrase in Greek that is translated to pass them by. Now, that phrase occurs 2 times in the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint. The first time it occurs, it is when Moses is up on the mountain receiving what? The 10 Commandments. Now, Moses cannot look upon God and what? Live. So God passes by. That's the phrase. Moses. And Moses only sees the back parts of God. And then the phrase is found again in 1 Kings chapter 19. You remember Elijah, the great prophet, is being persecuted by the evil king Ahab and his wicked queen, who? Jezebel. And Elijah flees in despair. He thinks there are no more followers of God in Israel. He goes up on a mountain and he hides himself where? In a cave. And God comes to Moses. And God shields Moses from the sight of him. And the Greek translation in the Septuagint says, and God passed by. The very same word, the mouth of the cave. So as you can see, the language that the storytellers here use, that Mark incorporates, implies what? An epiphany of God. The revelation of God to Moses, the revelation of God to the prophet Elijah. So you see the dynamic, the tension here in the story? Separation on the one hand, and reunion or epiphany, presence. That's so crucial to the message here. Keep it in mind. Then it says, but when they saw him walking upon the sea, they thought it was what? A ghost. And they cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, take heart, it is I. Be not afraid. Now, the little phrase that is translated here, it is I, in Greek is ego eimi. And that's used in everyday ordinary speech to say, it's me, I'm here. But again, Jewish storytellers and readers would not have failed to know that when Moses on the mountain asked God, who should I say that you are? What does God tell Moses? Tell them, and in the Greek translation, this is what it is. Tell them ego eimi, ha, and then the participle on. Tell them I am the one who is, the participle. So the language that's used here in this story suggests that the one from whom they have felt separated, have felt abandoned, and the one who now comes and is present is the Lord himself. He echoes the words of the divine here. I am. It is, I am, he says. Take heart, do not be afraid. Then he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased. So the separation here appears to be over. They are together again. And the sign of it is what? The adverse forces that have been persecuting, basanitzain, the disciples, that they have been struggling against, that stops. But it turns out that the reunion, the reconciliation is only partial. Look at the last part. And they were utterly astounded, for they did not what? Understand about the loaves. We'll talk more about that in the next story. But look at the very end. It says, but their hearts were what? Hardened. The disciples still don't completely understand who Jesus is. They're not completely reassured of his presence. So now we come to the meaning, a meaning I think we need for today in our situation. At the center of this narrative is the extraordinary epiphany of Jesus upon the water, accompanied by another miracle, the calming of the wind, and followed by the dumbfounded reaction of the disciples. In other words, the drama revolves around Jesus' separation from the disciples. He begins by compelling the disciples to go on ahead of him across the water. The disciples are in the middle of the lake, separated from Jesus by a great distance. And only at the end is the tension of separation partly dissipated by Jesus' reunion with the disciples in the boat. But even then, the resolution is not complete. The disciples still don't understand. They harden their hearts. Now, for the first storytellers and readers, this story expresses the feeling, I think, of the early followers of Jesus, some probably 25 years after his death and resurrection, 20 years after he had gone back to the Father in heaven, their feeling of being what? Separated from Jesus. And furthermore, the events of those years leading up to the great war between Rome and Jerusalem that broke out in the year 66, the events are drifting toward war. And the followers of Jesus also feel that they are under pressure. They're being persecuted. They are not making much progress in their life of faith. Separation has brought what? Some uncertainty and doubt. Some people have even hardened their heart. Do you see why? Do you see why I feel like we need this story right now so deeply? Here we are 2,000 years after the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, and we still pray that ancient prayer, Maran Atha, which means what? Our Lord, come. Our Lord, come. And as the world now appears to be careening toward war, more fighting breaking out, no one seems to be willing to stop it. partisanship and alienation growing. I don't know about you. I wake up in the morning and that old prayer rises in my consciousness. Maranatha, O Lord, come, help us. Well, this story is set. When is it set? In the fourth watch of the night. The hours between what? 3 and 6 a.m. In other words, it is the darkest moment. It's a moment like the one we may feel that we're in, that I feel. I worry about my little 3-year-old granddaughter and what kind of a world she is emerging into. It's the deepest and darkest just before the dawn. And then, just at that moment, we, like the disciples in this story, are hoping that God will do something, that God will intervene. And the story promises that God is with us. Jesus comes and says what? I am. Don't forget that. Don't be afraid. Keep hoping. Don't harden your hearts. Don't give up. Jesus returned to the disciples, tells us that we have Jesus with us. We have his aid, even when we're not aware of it. Even when we are tempted to despair. Well, the disciples still harden their heart. They are not fully filled with relief even after Jesus appears. And their incomprehension, it says, pertains to what? The loaves, which suggests it has something to do with the Eucharist. And we're going to turn to that story in just a minute. We're going to go back and look at the story of the feeding of the 5,000 and try to figure out what is it about the loaves that they didn't understand that kept them from being completely reassured by the presence of the one who says, I am. Don't be afraid. Okay. We've looked at our first story. You can probably tell from my own struggle, the passion that this story evokes in me. Let me hear your thoughts about this story of alienation, separation.
Is it significant, as it seems to me, that it says here, according to the author, that he actually intended to pass by. He intended to pass by like God intended to pass, like God did pass by Moses and Elijah. Right, but that was his intention, to pass by.
Yes, to pass by. But it is the same verb in Greek, to pass by. It's the same verb that was used in Exodus and in 1 Kings 19. So in Jewish tradition, this verb had become associated with what? The Epiphany, the Epiphany of God, even though no one can look directly at God and live.
Right. But I guess what struck me is it isn't the passing by, but the intention to pass by.
Yeah, he wished. He wanted.
But he did it because they called out.
That's right.
Right.
That's a good point, Ray. Yeah. He wished, he wanted to pass by, but they needed him. They called out. And so he got into the boat. And the adverse conditions that they were facing stopped. Good point. Other observations, Larry?
Well, I think the pass by, I don't know if it's the same Greek or not, is in the story of the blind men, I think outside of Jericho, where Jesus is, and they hear that he has been around, and they hope that he will not pass them by.
Right.
And he doesn't, he stops.
Right.
But so often, people who are in need like that are passed by others, like the priest and the Levite passed by the
That's right.
injured man, but Jesus is one who, when people call out, that he does not pass them by, maybe even if they don't call out, he doesn't pass them
It's
by.
a wonderful point. Wonderful
Well, and
point.
then you got that, that song, do not pass me by.
Right, right.
I had one other thought, and that is in the February issue of Christian Century, Peter Marty speaks of the presence of God where you feel abandoned. He's with somebody in a hospital, and the father of this child says, "Well, where is God?" And so he's trying to think, well, for myself, and he pictures himself as being so separated from God, like he's captured, and he's John McCain, or he's Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and he's in a cell, and he has no resources. He can't go to church, he can't talk to the pastor, and he's abandoned. Will he be able to find God? And he finds within that he has all these scriptures and hymns and whatnot that rise up, and in that he feels and senses the presence of Jesus, of God, like Bonhoeffer did. And so I decided, I have myself wondered a few times if I got captured and I was put in a jail, would I be able to survive? And
It's such a good point, Larry. Such a good point. In one of Bonhoeffer's poems that he wrote while he was in prison,
who am I?
who am I? Right? Who am I? Am I the one they say I am, confidently stepping forth from the jail cell? Or am I that lonely, fearful person, right, cowering in my cell? And he ends the poem by saying, who am I? Lord,
You know.
you know, you know. And in the last letter that he wrote from prison just before Christmas, the Christmas before he was killed, he wrote to his parents and his fiancée. And he said, don't think that I'm alone here in this jail cell. He said, my jail is full of light. As it says in the old German nursery rhyme, 2 wings hold me, 2 wings enfold me. So it's that moment when we feel separation, when we feel alone, when we cry out, right, as you said, that's the moment when we need to hear welling up within us the words of our Lord, I am. I'm with you. Don't give up. Yes.
Just maybe an observation from juxtaposing back then to now. You know, one of the things I think of is just the powerful aspect of that story that's about physical separation.
Yes.
With the boat being miles offshore and things like that. And then also comparing it to our society today with social media and depression and all these things, and the materialism, the consumerism,
Right.
and how far do we have to go before we give up on clinging to those things so that we can see what's being obscured in us, which is all the while God in us. We can see that, but we can't see that until the winds are sort of calmed, if you will.
Right.
But applying it in today's world. I see it kind of happening in some people, but it's just my hope is that somehow that can, we're probably gonna have to get pushed to the edge, and I wonder where that edge is. But it's just comforting to think about the story that you're talking about, and then how we can somehow continue to have hope that that's going to happen again. Sometime in our-
I really like what you're saying. You know, the disciples, if the language of this story reveals something, they felt they were struggling against adverse forces. And I think people who want to continue to profess that they are followers of Jesus today feel like it's increasingly difficult, right? Because in the popular culture, Christianity is associated with some values that we don't share. When my son arrived at Yale University as an undergraduate, he went to church every Sunday, but he went without telling his classmates because he was afraid that if they knew he was a Christian, they would draw conclusions about his attitudes that were not reflective of who he was. So we can feel today, right, that we're being persecuted, that we are struggling against the oars. And in that environment to continue to profess our faith, that we want to be identified as disciples of Jesus. You're really touching, I think, on something important.
We may not be persecuted, but we are being sued.
Yeah, right. Larry, can you say specifically what that refers to?
Yeah, well, the Sheets Corporation is suing us, the gas station. It may be.
I didn't realize that. I hadn't heard that. Oh, I'll have to go Google that when I get home and get up to date. Yeah. All right. The problem is that the disciples didn't understand about the loaves. So let's see if we can figure this out by turning to what will be our last miracle story for this semester, the feeding of the 5,000. Let's look at it. The apostles gathered around Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. Now, two things jump out at you here. This is the only place in the Gospel of Mark where the disciples are called what? Apostles. Do you see that? Nowhere else in the Gospel of Mark are the disciples referred to as apostles. So that suggests that this story, the meaning of it, is related to the mission that the disciples ought to have.
Where are we at?
We are at the beginning of Mark chapter 6, verse 30.
I don't think we have it in our.
Well,
Here it is.
It's on the back.
The apostles,
Well, no, I think the same one.
the apostles gathered.
I got that. You've got something else.
It's at the bottom of the page. It's at the bottom of the page.
Mary, you were on it, put it back where it was, right there, that's it, right there.
It's here at the bottom of the first page.
All right, sorry.
Do you see it? Do you have it? Okay. The apostles gathered around Jesus. It's the only place where they're called apostles in the whole Gospel of Mark, which suggests that the message of this story relates to their mission as people who are going to mediate and carry on the work of Jesus. And they told him all that they had done and taught. Here's another thing that jumps out. This is the only place in the Gospel of Mark where someone other than Jesus is said to teach, right? So the disciples come back. They've been on a mission. They come back to Jesus. They are identified now as apostles who are being sent. That's what apostello means, to be sent. And they want to tell Jesus what they have taught. He said to them, "Come away to a deserted place all by yourselves and rest a while." Now, this strongly suggests that Jesus is now, in this story, going to focus on the needs of the disciples. They need rest. Come away by yourselves. He wants to be with them especially. And the deserted place for Jewish readers and storytellers, of course, suggest that the background of this story is in the wilderness wandering of the people of Israel, where they became what? Hungry and needed to be fed with manna. And eventually they got tired of cream of wheat and they wanted quail. For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. Now, the Greek word here that's translated many is the word polloi, and it refers to a mass, a crowd of people. And here too we have a hint, a clue to the meaning, because polloi measures the magnitude of the need. The need is much larger than the disciple group. It embraces many, many people. And they went away in the boat to a deserted place by themselves. Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they hurried there on foot from all the towns and arrived ahead of them. 19th century New Testament scholars, including even the great Julius Wellhausen, pointed out the improbability of this little feature of the story. Sailing across the Sea of Galilee is much quicker than what? Going by land all around the edge of the lake. But that's not the point that the storytellers are trying to make. It is related to the pursuit of Jesus. That's what this communicates. The depth of their need. They are pursuing him. They are trying so hard. They are hurrying, and they want to arrive ahead of him. As he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had what? Compassion for them. The Greek is much stronger. It's that verb so frequently associated with Jesus. Splunk nixetai, which literally means what? He felt a wrenching in his guts. He had a gut-wrenching experience when he saw them. It's more just than compassion. It's more visceral. And then look what it says. Because, why did he have a gut-wrenching feeling? Because they were like what? Sheep without a shepherd. Now, this, of course, evokes two moments in Jewish tradition. The two great shepherds, who? Moses pasturing the flocks in Midian, and of course, who else? David, right. And so that's in the background of this story. And so he began to teach them many things. Already here we have a clue to the meaning of this story for us. How often, even right now, do we feel like we are sheep without a shepherd? We feel like our leaders have failed us. And we don't even see leaders that we would be confident in following. Lots of people say they're going to do what in the election? Stay home, right? They're going to vote by sitting on the couch because of despair, feeling like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. So like a good shepherd, he begins to fill them. When it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now very late." So the disciples point to geographical and chronological limits to the power of Jesus, to the power of God. Look at our circumstances. Look at this place where we are. Diane and I live on the west side of Dayton. We moved there in 1991. Year by year, more stores close, more houses are torn down. When Diane drives to her office, every morning she drives past no less than 5 piles of rubble from buildings that have been demolished. And the rubble has not been removed, the neglect, the abandoned houses. So we feel, I think, and this is true of lots of places in the United States. People in the country, in West Virginia, feel like they've been deserted, left behind by the global economy. We are in a deserted place, and the hour is late, the disciples say. They think that our circumstances pose insuperable limits upon Jesus and upon God. And so they say to Jesus, "Send them away that they may go to the surrounding country and villages and buy something for themselves to eat." Now, I know you may not be able to see it in English. In the Greek sentence, the word themselves is placed in emphatic position. In other words, the disciples' response to this situation is to throw people back upon what? Their own resources, right? Let them fend for whom? Themselves. Right? Oh, how often are we tempted to say that, to throw up our hands now and to say, let them fend for themselves. But he answered them, and here you have to read Greek to see it. It's emphatic, the first word, emphatic position. Humes, you plural. You give them something to eat. You want to throw them back upon what? Themselves. You're the one who should do it. The contrast is very strongly drawn here by the syntax of the Greek sentence. Who meets the need? Should they be thrown back upon their own resources? Or do you have some role in it? You yourself should do something about it. And they said to him, are we to go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat? Now, a denarius, like the one that Diane had made into a key ring for me, that's Claudius on there. A denarius is the wage of a day's labor. So 200 denarii would be what? 200 days worth of work. That's what the disciples, again, they raise the issue of an economic limitation. The resources are not there to really help people. 200, a whole 200 day, more than half a year's worth of work would be required to meet the need. And he said to them, how many loaves have you? Go and see. Now, of course, the loaves are associated, the bread in the Old Testament is associated with the Torah. The Torah, the law of God, the first 5 books of the Bible are frequently described in the Old Testament as bread, nourishment. How many loaves have you? Go and see. When they found out, they said, how many? 5. How many books in the Torah? 5. The Pentateuch, right? And then they also had what? 2 fish. Now, in early Christianity, the symbol of the fish, ichthus, became associated with what? Jesus himself. Exactly. And it shows up all over the place in early Christian archaeology. I just published a chapter in a big new book called The Village in Antiquity and the Rise of Christianity. And I looked at all the village churches in the Peloponnesus, southern Greece. And guess what the archaeologist found etched into the plaster of these early churches? The sign of the fish. They even found it in places where it would not have been publicly visible, so that the artisans, the workmen were what? Expressing their own faith or placing the building under the protection of Jesus. Right. On the book I published back in August on equality, the one that you read, Ray, there is an early Christian sarcophagus that is the cover art. It's from the Vatican, and it shows the Eucharist. And guess what is on the table? Along with loaves of bread that have the cross sign baked into them, what else is on the table? Fish. Laurie, you're right. Now that reminds us that the earliest Christian Eucharist was not just little sip of grape juice and a tiny wafer. According to 1 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul is upset that some people who come to the Lord's Supper are deprived of eating enough, and they leave the table how? Gripped with hunger pains. And other people eat and drink so much that they are what? Inebriated. Paul says they are drunken. So the earliest Eucharist was a full meal. It wasn't just a little piece of bread and a sip of wine. It was a full meal. And that's what is represented on that sarcophagus. Pete.
I kind of see wrapped up in this, and I want to see if you agree with me, that this is the first introduction of the Great Commission.
Yes. And that's already signaled at the beginning of the story when the disciples are called what? Apostles. And then it comes back when Jesus tells them that they have a job to do. You feed them, right? So you are right. Mark's gospel doesn't have a Great Commission, but this story is all about the commission. You're right, Pete. This story is all about the task that Jesus gives them, and in terms of the meaning for today, I think it's really important that we're finishing our work.
Well, they keep worrying about he's not there, but we all discover in our own spiritual lives that he's right in front of us.
Right. The disciples failed to fully appreciate the presence of Jesus with them when he came to them and got in the boat, because they didn't understand what? His presence with them constantly, every time that the Christians sat down at the table and did what? Broke bread in the Eucharist. So in that meal that we still eat together 2,000 years later, there is a resource that we need to fully understand, that needs to take a hold of us. So Pete, you're definitely on to it.
Eric?
Yes.
I just thought interesting to me, a contrast, the people that came running, or what, after Jesus.
Right.
They expected miracles. The disciples didn't expect a miracle.
That's right.
Why
Did you hear that?
contrast?
Yeah. The disciples think that there are all kinds of limitations upon God's power to act. Chronological, geographic, economic, but the people, their need is so great, right? And they're expecting that Jesus can meet the need. That's why they chase him around the lake. So you're onto something. In the Gospel of Mark, the demon-possessed, the spirit-possessed people, they recognize who Jesus is before the disciples do. So there's something about that need, right, that we ought to attend to. The need brings an understanding. It connects with Jesus' compassion, with his feeling a tugging in his guts. Yes, Larry.
I think this also is pointing out what I find in myself a deficiency, and that is as called upon to teach. I rarely, too few times have trusted the students to be able to do something. And therefore, as long as you're around, they will ask you, well, let's look to you to see how this should be done. And Jesus is a wonderful rabbi in this, that he trusts them and gets out of the way. And so long as he's there,
Right.
they're always going to be looking to him.
Right.
But then when he says, you take care of it.
Right.
No longer can they kick the can down the road. And the ascension means that gets himself out of the way.
Right.
So that they can, all of what Pete said,
Right.
the Great Commission.
That's exactly right. Teaching, providing for the needs of people. And this story does not hide from the fact that those needs can be what? Very physical. right? They can be hunger. They can be loneliness. But our commission also involves teaching, right? At the very beginning, the disciples come and they're so excited about what they have taught. And when Jesus has compassion on them, he then begins to teach. Okay, back to the story. So he sits them down in groups on the green grass. The grass is only green in Palestine when? In the spring. So this is a Passover story. That's the time of year. Another echo of the Eucharistic context. And he sits them down in groups of hundreds and fifties. Old Testament students, do you hear the allusion, the echo? In the wilderness, when Moses told the Hebrew people how to make camps, they made camps how? Hundreds and fifties, the text says. So taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, which are depicted in early Christian art as elements of the Lord's Supper, the Eucharist. And he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to his disciples to do what? Set before the people. So the disciples here are the mediators. Jesus doesn't give. He gives the food to whom? The disciples. That's part of their commission. The blessing here is very interesting. The Greek text is ambiguous. It's not clear whether he blesses what? The elements, the bread and the fish, or God, right? The Greek is unclear. Maybe the ambiguity is deliberate. The Jewish prayer over food, the one that our younger son learned as a student at the Jewish Community Center. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamotzi lechem min haaretz. Amen. Blessed art thou, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who gives us fruits of the earth to eat. Maybe the prayer, the blessing that Jesus said was something like that, which is a blessing of God for the food. But he breaks the loaves and gives it to the disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. And all ate and were filled. The emphasis here upon all eating and all being filled goes back to the need of the many, right? The many that need us, that needed the disciples. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of fish. Of course, the 12 baskets are symbolic of what? The 12 tribes, right? The 12 tribes of Israel. So the whole people. And they took up remnants. They took up extra. What does that tell you in terms of the message? The meal, the banquet, is not just a one-time thing that happens. It's not just a one-time miracle at this moment in the life of Jesus, because lots of fragments are taken up. The text suggests that the meal will what? It will go on. Gesundheit. It will be repeated in the future. By the way, I missed one little thing I should have pointed out. It says he told the people to sit down in groups. The Greek actually says he told them to recline in groups. Now, in the ancient world, when people went to a banquet, they did what? Reclined, right? And that suggests that this meal has the character of a banquet, right? That it's not like too often today when you go into churches and the organ is playing funereal music and the priest is speaking in somber tones. I'm talking about the little church in my neighborhood in the Bronx. You might think you're at Jesus's funeral, but no. Here we have an understanding of the early Eucharist that is a banquet. It's a celebration of the fullness that comes with Jesus' presence. So those who had eaten the loaves numbered 5,000 people.
That was it, 5,000 men.
Well, I know. Well, the text uses the word anthropoi, which is actually gender inclusive. It's not the word for male people specifically. That would have been andres, right?
Why would they have interpreted it this way then in the Bible?
Good question. I would guess that in the new Revised Standard Version, they've changed that to people. Yeah. Okay. Other observations, questions about this story from what you all have already said. I think you have already drawn the meaning for today. The meaning for today is that we have a mission. We are the mediators of what has to continue, of Jesus' transformation, of lives, Jesus meeting the deep need of people. So I would summarize it this way. I want to focus upon the role that the disciples play in this story, their mediating action. Jesus gives the broken bread to them, and they give it to the people. And he does this even though the disciples were initially resistant and skeptical. They were even sarcastic in response to Jesus. But Jesus keeps insisting, you have a job to do, even if you don't feel like you do. And in the end, they fulfill Jesus' command. And despite the disciples' thick-headedness and their disparaging attitude, Jesus takes the disciples as his co-workers. That's so important for me. I often feel like I'm a failure as a scholar and a teacher. And despite my failures, maybe Jesus would take me as a co-worker. One of the best pastors I know, Frank Anthony Thomas, pastored a big church in the Chicago suburbs and 10,000 member church in Memphis. He tells me that he frequently finds himself singing the old African American hymn, Lord, do you think I could make a soldier? Well, this story tells us that despite the thick-headedness and the disparaging attitude, Jesus takes the disciples as his co-workers. Even people that feel like they are failures can still be useful. They still have an apostolic calling despite their weakness. And I'm grateful to this story for making that point. The second meaning I take away from this story has to do with the hunger of people to be fed. The hunger not only for material things, but also for teaching. That hunger is fully recognized by this story, the need of the people. And finally, the story, I believe, was especially relevant then and now to the political and economic situation of people who want to be Jesus followers. Josephus, the Jewish historian, says that in the years leading up to the war, as Jewish society began to fragment, false prophets appeared, Theudas, a certain Egyptian, and they led people out where? Into the desert, where they claimed that they would bring the messianic time. Well, Jesus actually fulfills the hopes and the dreams, the expectations of people, but he does so not like Theudas and the Egyptian by raising an army. It's not by mobilizing a bunch of angry and envious people that Jesus satisfies needs. He does it by what? throwing a banquet. It's the loaves that is the solution. That's what the disciples failed to see. That the way forward through the dangers of their time in the years leading up to the Great War, it is the loaves. It's the banquet. It's for us, it is the Lord's Supper and everything that grows from that. The way in which we, having been fed, go to meet the needs of others. The collection of fragments tells us that the need will continue and that our work, our commission has to continue. All right, once again,
You 4 minutes.
I've talked for such a long time. Pete,
I find one thing that just amazes me is the disciples continue to miss Jesus in their midst until he breaks the bread.
right.
And I find that so amazing, that simple task of breaking the bread to eat it says to us that Jesus is in our midst and right next to us.
Right, right. I have to say, you all, that's the way I still experience the breaking of the bread in the Lord's Supper. When I come forward to receive, frequently, I find myself looking into the faces of my fellow congregants, and I see there the power of Jesus, his presence, right, around that circle. Last comments, questions, meanings. Yes,
We also, a lot of times associate apostles and disciples as the same thing.
yes,
But I've also heard apostles are more specific about the original 12.
yes,
Now in here, it says, starts out with the apostles,
yes.
but then when the food is distributed, it says disciples.
That's right. That's right. It's because they're still learning. And we, right? Even if we don't feel like we are fully authorized as apostles, we can still be mediators, right? Mediators of the shepherd, who blesses and breaks and then distributes to us. I still want to be a disciple, even if I don't always feel like an apostle. Thank you all a million times for the journey that we have taken this semester. In my opinion, it's been a wonderful journey. Thank you.
Well, Larry, thank you so much for your time and your effort, and this came together very well. So
Thank you.
look forward to having
Well,
you back again.
You and Jim made it happen. And I'm going to try to fulfill your request of going back and creating a list and inventory of the classes that I've taught here. It'll take some time because Larry Hopsis invited me to teach here in the January of 1992.
Oh, wow.
Thank you all so much.
Larry, since you, your